As you guys can see, today we're beginning a new series. And this series is entitled One. And what we're going to be talking about in this series are those people that God brings into our lives specifically for us to minister to lead to Jesus. In fact, I want to share something with you this morning, and this is not mine. It didn't originate with me, but I want to share this with you because it makes the point so well. It says, think about your life. You grow up, you graduate from high school, you then go off to college. And then a few years later, you graduate again. You marry the perfect person, move into your new apartment, and over the next couple of years, you buy a house, a dog, and start having kids. Well, time begins to roll by. The kids grow up. You get involved with your church, just like you're supposed to do. You have some opportunities to engage the outside world, but it's hard enough to balance your job, church, and family. Well, your life continues speeding along. Your children grow up, and they make you a grandparent. Eventually, you retire, and you spend some much-deserved time playing golf and traveling. And it's okay to relax because you've impacted your family. Finally, at the end of it all, the Lord calls you home, and it was a good life, right? Work, family, church, because that's all there is, right? But what would happen if you shook up that formula? Imagine you went out of your way to engage with our world. Co-workers, neighbors, friends, and not just engage, but disciple. Imagine if you took 1 year and discipled one person from our world. Imagine if you took just 1 year and really shared the message of love, salvation, and freedom in Christ to that one person. And what if inside that year that person began to follow Jesus? But let's not stop there. What if the next year that person began to disciple someone else? And you did that same thing and 2 more people came to Christ. And what if you did this year after year, person after person, and each of them picked one person year after year, and each of them, and each of them. If this kept going on for 30 years, that would mean that 1,073,743,824 people would come to know Christ. And that is much bigger than just your family. And here's the thing, it's not a joke. It's not a gimmick. It's not impossible. It's just one person at a time. One person making a commitment to lead one other person to Jesus. In fact, write this down this morning. This is so important. There is no way that all of us can reach all, but all of us can reach one. Say that with me this morning on the count of 3. I can reach one. You ready? 1, 2, 3. I can reach one. Just one. That's where it starts. That's where we begin. Now, some of you this morning, you may be thinking, but Slate, I just can't think of one person that, I feel like I need to lead to Christ or I feel like would come to Christ. And really, that's what this series is going to be about. Because God puts people into our lives. He brings people into our lives that He wants us to intersect with, that He wants us to be involved with so that we can lead those individuals into a relationship with Jesus Christ. And so what we're going to do over the next couple of weeks is we're going to be looking at some of the stories from the life of Jesus. And what we're going to see in these stories, hopefully, is the fact that there are even those that we may not even really feel like we could reach with the gospel of Jesus. But as we interact with them, as we go to work with them, as we see them in our neighborhood, that may be the very person that Jesus has put in our path to lead them into a relationship with Christ. I'll begin like this, and you may want to write this on your outline. Anyone can follow Jesus. And I think that's where we're delusioned many times. I think that's where we miss it. We see, people out here and maybe we in our minds think this is just not a good person. They would not be interested in Jesus. But here's the thing. Anyone can follow Jesus, even a tax collector. This is our story, Luke chapter 5, verses 27 through 32. Later, as Jesus left the town, He saw a tax collector named who, church? Named Levi, sitting at his tax collector's booth. "Follow me and be my disciple," Jesus said to him. So Levi got up, he left everything, and he followed Him. Later, Levi held a banquet in his home with Jesus as the guest of honor. And many of Levi's fellow tax collectors and other guests also ate with them. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the religious law complained bitterly to Jesus' disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with such scum?" Jesus answered them, "Healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do. I have come to call not those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners and need to repent." It's really hard for us to understand the radical nature of this story because really it's hard for us today to come up with a cultural equivalent for tax collectors. But I want to try, okay? I want you to really think about this. During that day and time, there in Palestine, the people were ruled by the Roman Empire. Now, the Romans, they did not rule with kindness. The Romans ruled with force, and the Romans ruled with fear. And so when they would conquer a land or they would conquer a people, they would send out soldiers with swords. Are you with me? And they were to use those swords if they needed to keep people orderly. If people were not orderly, if people did not remain under their control and keep the peace, then they had the power to kill them, to take their life. And so imagine growing up in a land where on every street you saw soldiers who had orders to kill you if you got out of line. Now here's the question, how do you support such a plan? They would conquer a place and then they would send in soldiers. How are you going to support all these soldiers who are keeping order? You tax the people. You take the money out of the people's pockets to hire these soldiers that you didn't want there in the first place. Well, how are you going to take taxes? Well, you're going to get locals to take up the taxes. Well, how are you going to do that? Well, you're going to tell them, look, this is how much we want, and anything you get above that, you get to put in your pocket. It's yours. I guess the equivalent of this today would be, let's imagine someone is working with you. They're working for your company and they are embezzling money from you. And the money that they are stealing, they are taking that money and they are supporting ISIS. How would you feel about that? You see, here's the deal. Tax collectors weren't just viewed as dishonest, they were disloyal. They weren't viewed as just cheaters, they were really traitors. And people absolutely hated them. Well, there is this young, new rabbi on the scene by the name of Jesus, and people are excited, and people are talking about him, and people are, kind of throwing around the rumor, could this be the Messiah? And one day, the people, they see Jesus, this young rabbi, walking towards this tax collector by the name of Levi. And you can imagine in their mind what they're thinking is this: man, Jesus is getting ready to let this guy have it. He is going to walk up to this guy, he's going to put his fist in his face, and he's going to say, "How dare you?" But they were shocked to see that Jesus walks up to this tax collector and he says, "How are you?" And how about you? Follow me and be one of my disciples. I mean, they were absolutely shocked. This guy is the worst of the worst. He is a traitor. He is a cheater. He's a tax collector. And then what really shocked the people is he went home and he ate with him. And the reason that was so shocking was during that day and time, the way you said to someone or the way you let other people know, "This is my friend," or "You are my friend," is you went home and you ate with them. And so Jesus goes home with Levi, this tax collector, and they eat together. Which really raises this very important principle. Write this in on your outline. Jesus made followers because Jesus made friends. You see, Jesus didn't just forgive sins. Jesus befriended people. And I'm not talking about Facebook friends. I'm not talking about people that we see occasionally. We say, "Hey, how you doing?" The commonalities or the courteosity of, "Hey," and you give them a wave or maybe a handshake. I'm talking about life-sharing, together friendship. Jesus made friends, and in turn, He made disciples. And man, did this make people upset. People started talking about Jesus, and some of the things that they were saying about Him wasn't good. In fact, Jesus says in Luke chapter 7, just a couple of chapters over, verse 34, "The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say He's a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and sinners." Now, some of this is true, but some of this is false. The falsehood is this: Jesus was not a glutton and He was not a drunkard, but because He associated with these people, they assumed that He was. But He wasn't. But what is true about this statement was that He was a friend of tax collectors and sinners. And the religious people of His day could not understand that. You see, Jesus was not like them, but He really did like them. And this is very important for us to understand, because during that day and time, they couldn't get it. They didn't understand. In their mind, their view of God is God hates people like Levi. And as a follower of God, being a godly person, then I am supposed to hate and stay away from people like Levi as well. But understand this: Jesus didn't come to change God's mind about us. He came to change our mind about God. One of the reasons He came was to show people that God was not like they had been told. God didn't hate people that they had been told that He hated. God wants to be friends with everyone. Even the one who has lived like His enemy. Again, I ask you the question, who can be invited to follow Jesus? And the answer is very simple, anyone. Anyone can follow Jesus, even that one that many times we dismiss because we kind of size them up and they're not like us. You know, I'm a Christian and I'm a good person and they're not a Christian and they're not a good person and I don't think they would be interested in Jesus at all. But let me tell you something, Jesus didn't dismiss those kind of people. In fact, Jesus says, that's why I came. Let me share with you two things that Jesus teaches us about friendship. First of all, we must see people as patients. Write that in on your outline. It's important. We've got to see people as patients, not problems. When you view people, how do you view them? Do you view them as problems or do you view them as people with problems? And I'm just going to be honest with you this morning. All of us have problems. And we're going to look around and we're going to look at people and we're going to say, you know what, this person is annoying and this person is difficult. And as we look around our world, there are a lot of people. Maybe it's our neighbors, maybe it's our coworkers. We look around, right? And we say, that person is just annoying and difficult. But you know what? So am I. And so are you. So when we see someone who's annoying and difficult, do we see them as a problem? Or do we see them with someone who has a problem? Because when we see people who are hard to like, again, it's very tempting for us to focus in on just those things that we don't like. I want to bring Ryan up here. And Ryan doesn't know a whole lot of what's going on this morning. I just called him beforehand. And he has really an interesting story. And I just wanted him to share some of that with you. Of course, Ryan was with us a couple of years back, him and his wife, Beth. And then they relocated to the Mount Dora area because that's where they began to work. Whoa, that's loud. Okay. Where they began to work. But when Ryan got to Mount Dora, he moved into a neighborhood where there was an interesting gentleman. In fact, Ryan, how would you say you would describe him at first?
So some of you younger generation here would probably have seen the movie Up. And there's an elderly gentleman named Carl in the movie Up. Very gruff, doesn't want to make any friends, doesn't want to communicate with anybody in the neighborhood, and very much wants to stay to himself. That would be this guy.
And so as the story progresses, I think you had some encounters with this gruff character, but then he kind of disappears. And you and Beth, you get word that something's happened.
Absolutely. So about a year ago, a little over a year ago, this guy, his name's John, he had kind of disappeared for about 7 to 8 days, and nobody in the neighborhood had heard from him. And normally you would see him out in the neighborhood. He was the type of man that would critique everybody's lawn. If there was a blade of grass out of place, he would turn them into the HOA. If your trash can was on the side of the house, he would turn you in. So nobody had heard from him. So a lady down the street had asked on Facebook for somebody to check. So they did a well check, and the Eustis police knocked on his door, and he came to the door. Of course, he was very upset because he was the type that does not want to be bothered, and he had thrown his back out working in his yard about 7 to 8 days prior to that, and he couldn't do anything. So a neighborhood lady put on Facebook that we should do a meal train for John. So my wife said, they put a meal train on there. Why don't we participate in that? And I'll be honest with y'all, at first, I was kind of like, oh, with that guy, I don't know if we need to do this. We need to be kind of apprehensive of that because he may snap somebody's head off. But after 2 or 3 times of asking, finally we agreed to do it, and Beth signed us up on the Facebook page to take John a meal down. So I went down that first time. Beth was kind of like, well, why don't you go down and kind of see how he responds to you, okay? So I tapped on the door, and I'll never forget, John kind of cracked the door, but he didn't want to open that door all the way. And I said, hey, Mr. John, I said, we brought you some food down. I'm sorry about your back. He took the food and said thanks and basically shut the door. I was like, wow, that didn't go over very well. But over time, I did that another time. Slowly, that relationship began to form, and I started to form a relationship with him. And eventually, I think about the 3rd or 4th time, he invited me in. We began to converse, found out he had no family, he had no kids. He was just by himself, basically. And I became really good friends with him. It's kind of a neat story. I mean, we communicate literally on an everyday basis. He was not happy with me moving here, but I still try to go back and see him, and we stay in touch literally on a regular basis. So it's a pretty cool story for something so simple as a meal can open up the door to that opportunity to be an example to John.
And you even got to the point to where he started having you go to the grocery for him, and you would go down and check on him every day.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely. But me and John, until I moved down here, I probably have seen John on a consistent basis of 5 to 6 days a week. And I could go over with you right now, you guys will laugh, but John is a creature of habit. So on a weekly basis, he would want about 5 things. He would want a cherry pie, a bundle of bananas, a pack of peaches, a roll of Scott's toilet paper. Don't get him anything else besides Scott's because I will have to take it back. Those 4 or 5 items I would...
As parents, all of us as parents, we raise our children, and we raise them in a way to where we try and keep them away from certain situations and temptations because they're too young and they're too immature at times to handle those things. And so I understand the tension in all of this. But Jesus has called us to be missionaries. Jesus Himself was a missionary. In other words, He left where He was and He went to a place to help people that He needed to reach. And that's what Jesus has called us to. I mean, can you imagine a doctor saying, I'm not going to the hospital. The hospital is just full of sick people. And I might catch a disease. Well, we all know that's where a doctor belongs. And in a similar sense, Jesus says to you and me as Christians, you are a light in this world. And you are the salt of this earth. And so I want you to go out and I want you to be in the world, but not of the world. And I want you to let your light shine. I remember when I was 16 years old, my dad came to me and he said, son, you're going to work for me during the summer. And so I went to work at Tollgate Garment, my dad's shirt company. And to kind of give you an idea of the environment that I was in at 16 years old, my dad had to put signs over the water fountains that said, do not spit your tobacco in the water fountains. And he was talking to the ladies. Okay, now that kind of gives you a perspective of the kind of environment that I was in. I heard, I saw, all kinds of things. But even at 16 years old, I was a light. In fact, I had people at times who asked me about my faith. And I don't know that I ever led anyone to Christ. But even at 16, God could use me. And He can use you. Luke chapter 5, verse 29, it goes on to say, later Levi held a banquet in his home with Jesus as the guest of honor. Many of Levi's fellow tax collectors and other guests also ate with them. And the question is, why did Jesus do that? Jesus, you know who's going to be there. And you can almost hear Jesus saying, yeah, I know. And hopefully after it's over, I'll have a lot more friends. You see, here's what we have to understand. Typically, community precedes conversation. Right? You guys have heard me say that. Before people care about what you know, they have to know that you care about them. And that's John with Ryan. Before he could ever talk to him about coming and being a part of God's family, he had to know that Ryan cared about him. That he could really trust him. And I'm going to tell you, I wish I could tell you another story about Ryan. He's an evangelist. I mean, he really is. He's gifted at it. You guys remember Adam, and before he left to go to Mount Dora, Ryan worked with a guy here in Winter Haven. He was a teacher as well, and Ryan ends up inviting him to church. And then even after Ryan left, Adam was led to Christ. And then shortly after that, he joins Ryan at Mount Dora, and he's a teacher at the Christian school there. But it all began with showing someone, listen, I care about you. I love you. And that's what we see in the story of Jesus. And so Jesus goes to the home of Levi and he eats with his friends. And man, Jesus was criticized for it. But everyone was worth it for Jesus. Even Levi. And I love that story. I love how he led Levi to Christ. It's just neat to see how Jesus, he doesn't go up to Levi and say, you know, I expect a lot more out of you, Levi. You know, when are you going to change? When are you going to turn your life around? No, he doesn't confront Levi with a lecture about his past. He approaches him with an offer for his future. He just walks up to Levi and he says, follow me. And you have to understand that this is the absolute worst version of Levi. But Jesus sees potential. Jesus takes us as is. You guys know what as is, right? You've been to a store and maybe there's a clearance section and there's a sign that says as is, and what that means is that you're getting something that's flawed. Maybe it's got a nick in the shirt, maybe it's got a stain, but you know up front that it's flawed, and so you're buying it as is, and Jesus takes us as is with all our flaws. And He says, follow me. In fact, it's really cool as you look at the Gospels, you don't ever see anyone who changes and then starts following Jesus. When you read the Gospels, what you see is story after story of people who started following Jesus and then they began to change. And that's with all of us. Every single one of us needs Jesus. And I wish more people understood that, because so oftentimes I've encountered people who I've invited to church and they say, man, I would never go to church full of a bunch of hypocrites, full of a bunch of sinners, it's full of a bunch of sick people. And they're absolutely right. The church is made up of a bunch of sick people who are following Jesus, but they're getting better. Because Jesus is the answer. Jesus is the great physician. You see, you don't change and follow Jesus. You follow Jesus and you start changing. Several years ago, Julie, my wife, was at a yard sale and she found a bunch of Halloween costumes for Shepherd. G.I. Joe, Peter Pan, just a slew of Halloween costumes for a little boy, but Shepherd was too little. Really, he was more like an infant. And so when she came home with all these costumes, I looked at Julie and I was like, what were you thinking? These costumes are way too big for Shepherd. And I'll never forget what she said. She looked at me, she said, Slate, he'll grow into them. And in a spiritual sense, when you start following Jesus, when you get baptized and His Spirit comes and lives with you, and you are clothed with Christ, over time you began to grow into the image of Christ.